This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Mr. Usher first. Mr. Usher, you talk about greenwashing. I would like to have some information from you. What is your definition of greenwashing? Can you give us some example of greenwashing and how it can be used by people to dodge their responsibilities?
Yeah. It's a very good question, and there's not a precise definition as today. I think if you take a consumer awareness view of greenwashing, is essentially selling a product based on some sort of something incorrect in what they're selling, and so there have been a couple of cases, or a number of cases brought against companies, brought against investors, some by financial regulators, some by advertising regulators, which have been made accusations around mis-selling a product. And it's typically been products around how green we are, how net zero we are as a company or as a bank. But I think coming back to the transparency issue and also the need for a taxonomy, it's quite hard to have a clear definition of a greenwash unless you can have a definition essentially of transparency of what is sustainable versus what isn't. I hope that provides a partial answer.
Yes, obviously, as you said, it's not a very clear situation to address. But the point is that a lot of people are very upset when they see big meeting, in the middle of the desert with a lot of airplane and especially personal jet going there, and people saying, okay, they want to save the planet, but they use personal jet. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it requires company leaders to be able to justify the decisions they make, how they spend their company's resources. And I think a lot of company executives are getting some pressure in this area. At the same time, I think air travel is considered a critical form of transport. In some jurisdictions, like in Europe, you're seeing some countries who are regulating short-haul flights should be replaced by trains, where that under a couple hours of distance. But I think overall the view is that an industry like the air industry needs to continue, and it's going to take longer to decarbonize. It's one of the industries where there's a talk of the need of carbon offsets because it's hard to totally switch over. But other industries can move more quickly to provide a balance.
Well, my personal thought on that is that as long as people will use that kind of travel and that kind of event and that kind of event, and they made their own choice, well, the industry will work on that. But this is another issue. Let me be more positive now. You talk about room to innovate. You said that during your testimony a few minutes ago. Talk to us about room to innovate. How can the companies and big emissioner can reduce their emission by innovation? Do you have some example to provide to us?
We have a booming industry. We have $1.8 trillion US that invested in the energy transition last year, investing in new business models, new manufacturing, new uses of technologies. And so this is a booming market. It's a very sizable part of the economy. And I think one of the questions for Canada, how much of that market are Canadian companies going to capture?
So do you think that to have fiscal incentive in new technologies to reduce emission is a good roadmap to follow?
That's part of the roadmap. And I think to my comments, a whole of government approach is what's required. Incentives are certainly useful, particularly for new technologies that are not yet proven. However, incentives on their own probably are not sufficient. We need transparency in the market, and we need a regulatory framework that provides certainty and a sense of direction that the private sector can invest against. Just to give one example, Japan, they have issued transition pathways for their main sectors, their main industries. So they give for the steel, for cement, for agriculture, for buildings, a view to the private sector is to say, this is how we believe this industry is going to decarbonize. That provides signals of certainty that allows investors to invest against.
What about the green energies like hydroelectricity, éolien, solaire, geothermal, nuclear? Do you think that we should fast-tracking those projects, giving green light to green energy?
Yes, I think few would question that, and most countries are doing that quite at scale. I'm not a specialist in the Canadian energy sector. I know there's a lot of hydro, but Canada should be a renewable energy superpower. It's hard to think that Europe has more renewable energy resources than Canada, but the scale of investment in renewable energies in Europe far outstrips. In the UK, in China, in India, all of these countries far outstrips the investment in Canada.
Thank you very much.
Can you explain how important it is, the transition finance for a country like Canada?
Yeah, it's very important. And to follow on from Hugh's comments, transition planning and having understanding the notion of transition finance, and this is where we need definitional work, and including a taxonomy is quite critical, particularly for resource-intensive economies like Canada's. It's not so much about what is green; it's what is greening, and part of the understanding is many actors in the economy, including those who are quite carbon-intensive today, have to be part of the solution, have to drive the carbon out of the system within their business models. To do that, they need transition finance.
Okay.
And so a critical part of the taxonomy will be defining essentially what is transitioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe just to follow up on that, can you talk a little bit about the areas that you support in that bill and what strengths you see?
I think the notion widely is that we need to start to understand how we align with a societal objective, essentially of the net zero transition. And I think elements of that proposed bill bring in more of the pieces that are required. A taxonomy and disclosure is a step, but there need to be responsibilities also within the corporation around governance, around expectation around transition planning, and essentially every company needs to be expected to put forward what they believe they're going to do as part of these changes which are underway. I think that the bill covers more elements, so it is a step forward. But as I mentioned, there are some concerns around capital weighting and adequacy, which we believe are not yet. There's not enough evidence yet, maybe, to put that into legislation.
And I'm curious, Canada's considering the role of natural gas in the taxonomy, and there are a number of organizations, experts who have raised concerns about including natural gas as transition or, sustainable under the taxonomy. Do you have concerns with including fossil fuels in the taxonomy?
It all depends on context. What is the natural gas replacing? And are there guardrails around that? Because I think for the coming years, there's an expectation that fossil fuels are required. But in 30 years from now, are they still required? And therefore, if you can put guardrails on investment out for how long an investment is expected to operate, potentially natural gas needs to be part of that transition. But every country will be different, and it's up to every country to figure out how to make that transition.
And if other countries exclude natural gas, is it in Canada's benefit to align more closely with, say, European Union countries who might be headed down that route?
A lot of it depends on what becomes a standard. And I'm not sure I can clearly answer the question. It really depends. If gas is replacing coal, that's probably a good thing. But if 30 years from now, gas shouldn't be operating because wind can ease lower costs, then the question is, why are you putting the gas on the grid in a way that requires 30 years to pay it back? Maybe you only need 10 years. These types of discussions are what have come up in Europe because of the Ukraine war. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, some gas has been brought in, but most of the investment has been in renewables because at the end of the day, economics has played out, and wind and solar are the major sources of new capacity on the continent, even if certainly there has been some gas additions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I guess my questions will be for Mr. Usher, and I look forward to Mr. Miller's submissions in writing, assuming the chair doesn't approve a field trip to Paris in the near future. So. So, Mr. Usher, I wasn't quite clear from your opening statement. Like, what specific, particular, tangible public policy asks of the Government of Canada are you looking for?
Taxonomy. And the next one would be an expectation around transition planning. And Hugh had mentioned that the UK Transition Task Force is considered sort of best practice. Those would be the two steps: an expectation that companies start to disclose based on a commonly agreed Canadian relevant, but also interoperability in terms of with other taxonomies, Europe, etc., to provide clarity, and then the expectation around providing a plan for how the company expects to deal with the changing climate.
And what does the taxonomy piece look like from your perspective?
Well, if we talk about the European one, and many have followed that, there are for each economic sector there are limits set on essentially you have to emit below so many tons per whatever the measurable is per that sector, let's say per kilowatt hour, to be considered sustainable. But you have to do it with no significant harm. So essentially, you have to show as well that you are not creating environmental or social harms in other areas. So it's not to say we run after something which is really green, but also creates damages in another way. So that's basically the structure of the Europeans and most others as they follow. But then once again, it has to be specific to the local economic context. And as we said earlier, defining what is transitioning is a critical role for the Canadian taxonomy.
So what happens if a company is not considered sustainable?
Well, at this point, it's free open markets. And so nothing. It's up to the markets to decide. But if the markets start to believe that with the proper with the proper information, they understand that an industry is ready for disruption, they make decisions on that. And the best example I would have is the Tesla effect. What happened to the value of automotive companies globally when one electric vehicle company all of a sudden became what most investors believed was the future of that industry? And every industry is going to go through or is already going through the Tesla effect of that sort.
Okay, so it's not considered sustainable in terms of environmental terms. It's considered sustainable in terms of economic terms. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think, as we think of environmental issues in a financially relevant way, it's basically, if you are polluting to the environment, the expectation, an investor will say, well, eventually that's going to be priced, that's going to be made illegal, your business is going to be outmoded. And so you need to properly monitor the impacts that you have, including on the environment, and how they will come back and affect you in a financial way.
Okay, so in terms of being made illegal, so that's something I hadn't heard before. So it's a way to anticipate like the next industry that the government will make illegal, and therefore investors should not be investing in this company if it's going to be made illegal before the investment is recouped. Is that?
Just say yes or no, Mr. Usher, please, because we're really running out of time.
Yeah.
Yes, I think
differentiation between physical risks, transition risks. What I'm talking about, transition risks, which is policy change, which is technological change, and which is consumer change. And any of those can lead to a devaluation of a business model.
I think Canada is positioned to be a sort of superpower in leading the energy transition and greening our financial system is part of that. I would ask you, I think Canada is ready because we have legislative and regulatory pieces we've put in place, the Net Zero Accountability Act, carbon pricing, an oil and gas cap, clean electricity regulations, and others. We have investment tax credits, which are rolling out, and we have blended finance, which we've embraced. What we do not yet have is mandatory climate-related disclosures or a taxonomy in place. Can you speak to how important it is to create the right enabling conditions that those two pieces be put in place? You've mentioned them, but what's really at stake?
I think to my earlier comment, it's about creating the sense of inevitability that this transition is underway and is going to be, backed, supported by government. And that's what investors will invest against. And so, as you mentioned, you have, world-leading carbon pricing. You have leaders, economic leaders in many areas. Mining, critical minerals is a key new industry that has to develop. So you have a lot of the resources, but the problem, what you lack is the transparency for investors, particularly international investors, to come in and see that this transition is underway and that it makes sense financially to invest in that transition. Other markets are ahead in that way.
So, Mr. Usher, I wonder if we could revisit the taxonomy and the logistics from the company's perspective. So, how, if you have one, factory that makes gas-guzzling SUVs and another factory that makes bicycles, and another factory that makes something else, how does each company go about getting its particular classification in the taxonomy system?
Well, it's a breakdown of based on industry classifications. NACE is one of there are some different classification systems, and the taxonomy has to choose which one they use, but they exist. And then essentially there is a threshold for each economic activity of what is considered sustainable. Most taxonomies have started with climate mitigation, but some of them are expanding to some other areas. And so it takes the bicycle manufacturer to go in and look at their activity and to say, are bicycles considered sustainable? They will be, I think, in most instances. An auto manufacturer will go in and say, okay, I need to sell autos below a certain percentage of carbon per mile driven to be considered sustainable. They probably have a mix of vehicles, and essentially they have to consider how are they going to apply to the taxonomy based on the mix that they have. But they have the expectation, if they want to secure investment, to say we probably need to transition our fleet over time to get into what's considered the sustainable form of automotive transport.
Okay, and so the companies have to approach the Bank of Canada to become classified, or the Bank of Canada is going to have inspectors with clipboards to come out to all these companies? How does that work?
But these companies already report, and so essentially, as part of their disclosures, they will be expected, and this is what's happening in Europe, and this is what's coming to Canadian companies that operate in Europe, that they do various disclosures as part of being in the financial markets, and this will add. There is a cost associated with such disclosures, and it depends on the type of company. But it's true that there are activities involved in being able to do this. But essentially, I'm sorry if I can't give more detail of that's a rough description.
You have a high-level estimate of the costs associated with these disclosures?
No. I mean, companies already know how much they spend on disclosures, and there's a whole audit industry built up around financial audit. And so it's going to depend significantly on the type of company. And one of the requirements is, and someone mentioned, that SMEs are an important part of the Canadian economy. You typically have to think about, if you have initial legislation, probably you don't go for the SMEs to start with. You go with large companies who are more capable of doing this work. But over time, large companies source much of their product from small companies. And if they are expected to do Scope 3 disclosures, which is essentially carbon in the value chain, eventually they need to source that information from including SMEs. So it is a whole of a economy approach. But disclosures are something that the whole economy already does. This is adding in one more objective.
And this is for every company in the country?
Yes, sir. A brief answer, please, Mr. Usher.
Well, in Europe, when it started, it was 277 large companies, but now it's growing. It's the larger companies to start with, but that includes now 1,100 Canadian companies are going to have to be reporting to Europe because they operate there.
Thank you. Thanks very much.